Oh hi, I didn't see you there. This is Dwarf Fortress, a fantasy world simulator and video game about building fortresses for dwarves, and it's a game that's very widely known for its complexity, which people often confuse with its difficulty. Dwarf Fortress in and of itself isn't that difficult of a game. In fact, people who start to play it often realize that it's quite simple, because the dwarves are quite hardy and the minute-to-minute management isn't that hard to lift, at least once you've come to grips with the basics. But there's no denying that statements about the depth of Dwarf Fortress are unquestionably true. And that's how people like myself can continue to enjoy the game after the thousands and thousands of hours that I've put into it. But there's one thing in Dwarf Fortress that players new and old all fear, myself included, and it's sitting there right in the middle of your screen. No, not the cat. Just to the right, yes, that. Yeah, the water. Every Dwarf Fortress player fears water, and if they don't, they should. And here's why. The aptly named Surprise Town was a small fortress nestled on the edge of the ocean. This ocean was enchanted and was filled with creatures that were known to exist in the joyous wilds. The shore was similar, and the random wandering megafauna was proof of this. This place was the home of the untamed wilds. And as the dwarves began to settle in Surprise Town, the omnipotent player who was running the fortress had a little challenge in mind. I decided to play this fortress without a single alert enabled. So at the very beginning of the embark of the fort, I went through and disabled all of the alerts, making it so that when jobs canceled or things attacked me, I would have no real sense or idea that it was happening. And this forced me, the player, to pay some very close attention to how I was constructing the fortress. A long-running hallway leading towards the fortress was necessary, because I would need to see any threats before they arrived, as well as the verticality of the fortress was designed so that I could see potential issues as they were happening in real time, instead of having to rely on the game to notify me of them. However, this overcompensation and caution that I was taking led to me making some rookie mistakes. I was setting up a well at the bottom of the fortress, and to do this, I needed to put water into the well. After digging out a reservoir for the water to collect, I set up a pump system, which I would then connect to the salt water. And I absent-mindedly constructed the pump one layer further down than I initially thought I had. Essentially meaning, instead of being on the surface level with the ocean, allowing me to pump the water out of the ocean and into the tube down into my well, I was one layer down, beneath the ocean, which I was then going to be pumping from that layer into my well. Now, the positive side of this is that there was a lot of water that was very quickly pumped into my well. The negative side of this is that there was a lot of water that was suddenly pumped into my well, because all of the excess water is instantly ejected into the place that the pump is pumping, as fast as it can refill. And because there was a lot of water infinitely refilling the spot the little pump was pumping from, it filled way faster than I expected and caused half of my fortress to flood. Thankfully, the casualties were minimal, and the overall drainage wasn't too big of a problem, because I'd prepared the necessary steps in advance to make sure that if it would flood, it would drain. So what were those steps exactly? Well, let's talk about it. The first precaution I took was, instead of simply digging directly into the ocean, I dug a small channel next to the pump, and then had a dwarf smooth and then fortify the wall using crossbow fortifications, opening up a hole in the wall without letting the entirety of the ocean in. And while this won't stop it from refilling as quickly as it does stop it from bubbling up over the top and flooding the room that the water enters into. The second thing that I did was I made sure I had a little overflow space right next to where the well would open up into the fortress, so that the majority of the water, if it did overflow, would flow that way. The sad part here was 2 dwarves drowned, but also that all of that sweet ore down in the reservoir can now no longer be as easily accessed, at least until the well empties out, which might take a while. But after that brief moment of sheer terror, Surprise Town settled into a state of normality. And for the most part, the fortress was progressing well. The dwarves had began farming on all of the mud that was created by the very unfortunate flooding, and this created a food surplus in the fortress, which allowed them to begin working on other projects, such as collecting coal for future smelting, and the migrants began to roll in. So the dwarves constructed a skylight with their new sand and glass industry, and the dwarves began designing the guild halls that would shape the fortress as it grew, and the dwarves noticed and began taking part in the new engraving demonstrations. And honestly, the No Alerts challenge had me feeling quite proud of myself. Aside from that random goblin appearing in a cage, the fortress was progressing well and things were easy enough. and I wasn't finding the challenge to be too difficult. And thus we continued with the rapid expansion, and in real time a week went by, so it had been a few days since I'd worked on the fortress last, and we finished up our beautiful tavern and filled it up with a statue of the most terrifying thing in Dwarf Fortress. And our expert engravers from the guild began engraving the floors to make sure that it was the highest quality and the highest value. Of course, more bedrooms were needed, and I stuck with this very tall ceiling design so that I could see what was happening. And the front of the fortress began to come together, complete with proper statues of various creatures that we'd caught, and of course the first 2 animals that we had to butcher. But the fortress needed defense, and it needed to be something that I could see at a distance. So, because we have this very convenient ocean, I figured it would make sense to just make a giant reservoir, fill it up with water, and then when bad things show up, put the reservoir in the front hallway that the bad things walk through, thus turning them into soup. So we got to work building a very large hallway, and the dwarves began digging through the tunnels, complete with an overpass and drainage ditches, which would have bridges built on top of them. As the constructed bridges came together and the reservoir itself started to take shape, I also prepared a drainage ditch, using the original drainage ditch, but with the addition of being able to drain water off the side of the map, because on the very edge of the map, I fortified the walls similarly to how I let the water in. If you go right up to the edge of the dirt, fortify walls, water can flow off of the map. It's a very useful technique if you need to prepare places for water to drain, just in case you get too much where you don't want it. Or in this case, where I wanted to create a literal river that would flow through the base of my fortress. And I began to set up the pump system similarly to how I set up the previous one, with a slightly larger space below it for more water to fill in. I also set up a little drawbridge at the end of the initial tunnel, just in case I needed to block the flow. I constructed the pump, as well as a door that I would use as an airlock, so that a dwarf could run away if water began to bubble up too high. And remember that goblin from earlier? Well, it turns out they were a were-raccoon, and because we were getting sieged, I thought I would test it out on that siege. And of course, were-creatures transform on the full moon of every month, so right before the moon became full, I released the creature, and the little goblin scampered out of the roof trapdoor that I'd prepared for it, and then directly towards the little goblin siege. After getting very distracted by a goat for a moment, it then took on the army proper, but was unfortunately ineffective and fell much faster than I wanted it to. It didn't even infect a single goblin. It was quite disappointing. But with that brief distraction aside, we got back to the pump construction. I decided to place several grates at the end of the pump, because water can be pumped through grates, but creatures can't climb out of them. And because we'd seen a giant squid earlier, I was a little worried something might crawl in. I connected the center grate to a lever so it could be opened like a trapdoor, and opened it up so that the dwarves could enter. And then we had a dwarf carve a fortification at an angle to let in the ocean water. But I miscalculated slightly. What I should have done is fortified that center block right there, which would have caused the water to flow in much quicker and possibly drowned this dwarf. However, that would have provided enough water for the pump to be able to pump consistently. But because I did it at an angle, it removed all pressure from the water, which I did as a precaution. I would later come to regret this decision. But no matter, I had work that needed to be done, and began working on a vertical pumping system that would power the pump itself, essentially building a bunch of water wheels above the pump that would then connect back down to the same pump. So once I got it started with a dwarf, as you can see here, it would then continue to pump indefinitely. A nifty little system, kind of taking advantage of similar systems that other players use. I always like to come up with my own methods for such things. But I was getting impatient. The water wasn't filling as quickly as I needed it to, and so I made a grave miscalculation. I dug an extra tunnel and told a dwarf to go channel down to where I thought was directly above the fortification I had initially carved. But what I was in fact doing was channeling directly down through the ceiling to create an open hole. This was an error on my part, and because of the depth that we were at, the entirety of the ocean entered my fortress. And as I sat there petrified in fear at what I had just done, my fortress flashed before my eyes. I should Alt F4 and go back to an earlier save, but I thought there was a chance that I could potentially recover this. And even as I watched the surface of the ocean break beneath the lost pressure that was then venting into my fortress, and witnessed as every single one of my dwarves got into some stage of drowning, and the tidal wave engulfed all of my hallways, filling up my admittedly rather deep, multi-level fortress, and covering it with a thick layer of dense, salty fish poop, Some of the dwarves were lucky and were in a secluded region of the fortress that didn't get fully flooded. And slowly, as the floods spread, the population began to fall, beginning at the grand number of 114 dwarves. But that number would rapidly begin to drop. Unknown to me, a dwarf had also been making an artifact at the time, and happened to make the most timely artifact I've ever seen. Thankfully, this artifact was also made in an area of the fortress that was safe from the water. So not only did they make the thing that we absolutely need to save this fortress, they also did it somewhere safe, so shoutouts to you, dwarf. But the same couldn't be said for most of the dwarves in the fort, because the bodies began to pile up. Those of you out there with really good memories might also remember that I mentioned making a drain at the edge of the fortress. That was the only thing preventing this fortress from flooding entirely. If I hadn't done that tiny little carving over there, this entire fortress would be gone. Or, at the very least, it would be significantly more full of water. And as the last few dwarves took their last breaths, some learned to swim. Didn't change the fact that most of them drowned. And the ocean was looking rather dry. So I told the dwarves to put on their hip waders and grab the pickaxe that they had. Fortunately, there was 2 of them, and they began chipping away at the back wall to create another, bigger drain. Somehow I had to lock that drawbridge from earlier, but I also needed the frame rate to increase a little bit, so I wanted to get rid of some of this water. Eventually, the dwarves had cleared enough rock that I could start fortifying the edge. This allowed the water to begin flowing off the map, at least the stuff that got into the room that my remaining dwarves were currently occupying. I also told the dwarves to build up to the tavern, so that the ones on the lower level could access the food and drink on the upper level. The few that had been partying when the flooding began probably considered themselves very lucky at this point. But there was a lot of work that needed to be done, so I told the remaining dwarves who were still alive to begin working on coffins, because we're going to need a lot of them. Work was slow but steady. It turns out it takes a lot of computing power to keep track of an ocean that's rapidly draining and refilling at the rate of this, so the frame rate was real bad. But thankfully, I had built, essentially, rafters into the design of this fortress, with the tall rooms. This was of course due to the no notifications challenge I was doing, which allowed me to build little scaffolding pathways and then walk through the tops of the rooms, releasing the trapped dwarves and eventually making my way to the manager's office, which also happened to be the main control room for the dwarves. Some of the citizens were also practicing their climbing in an enthusiastic method of stating, "Hey, please dig to me, and I will absolutely be loyal to the fortress for the rest of my life." At the very least, they're getting some good climbing and swimming training. But the mission of the fortress was clear. I needed to get to the manager's office. That's where all my levers were located. And thankfully, digging my way over there wasn't too much of a challenge. And quite quickly, I was able to close off all of the drawbridges, sealing off the entry hallway, and completely separating the ocean from the fortress, which allowed it to begin to drain. And of course, permitted the ocean the opportunity to refill. And for the few sickos out there, this is an ocean refilling in ASCII. But for the rest of you, it was mostly just a relief for my computer, going from a personal space heater to a nice humming fan. The frame rate returned, and thus progress of the water draining accelerated. But we had a large mess that needed to be cleaned, because Surprise Town was not quite done yet. Population had to recover for the fortress to continue, so the dwarves got back to work.
Bring out your dead!
Ideally, the calamities were behind us, and we were beginning a path to recovery. First things first, we had to get our military back in order, because more than half of them drowned. And because attacks are inherently surprising, it was something I had to be prepared for. Bodies were piling up, and I needed to get them disposed of, so more coffins needed to be built. And of course, the renovations must begin. Tables had to be overturned and cleaned under. Unfortunately, this required destroying a lot of the engravings on the floor. Thankfully, most of the original artisans had died in the Great Drowning, so thankfully they won't be around to complain about the art defacement. The whole front hallway had to be stripped out as well. This whole thing was going to be quite the ordeal. But I was determined to take advantage of this new spontaneous flooding problem that I had, so I figured I needed a bigger drain in case it happened again, or if I did it intentionally in the future. So I dug down to the caverns, which was conveniently covered in mud. It's gonna get some more of that. I also put together a temporary hospital because apparently somewhere along the lines I sustained some injuries, and I was working on a plan, a proper way of taking advantage of this beautiful ocean and spontaneous drowning. So what I did was just above the cavern layer, I dug a little floor here. In the center of it, there's a little staircase. That is going to be dug all the way up to the ocean and positioned neatly beneath this little plank. And at the very end of it, I'm building a little structure. This structure consists of 3 main parts. A wall piece. On top of that wall piece, there are several floor tiles, which are supported by the wall piece, and then a support pillar, which gets connected to the bottom of the floor tiles, supported by the wall piece, and a lever. But we'll get into the specifics of that later, because right now the dwarves are digging underneath that structure. This requires digging out stairs and open floors that can be easily caved in from something falling from above. Once I've dug the whole stairway out, I will fill it back in with walls, with the exception of where I want the water to come through, at the top. Now what you're looking at here is a support pillar, 4 floor tiles, and some ramps. The dwarves can get on top of the support pillar using the ramps, where they have constructed floors. Underneath those floors, I am placing a support. Currently, the support is being suspended from the ceiling above it and the floor next to it. But once a support is constructed, I can deconstruct the floor next to it. Diagonals are not considered load-bearing in Dwarf Fortress, meaning when I connect this support to a lever, once this diagonal has been deconstructed, if the lever is pulled, it destroys the support, causing the floor tile to fall. And underneath that, I'm currently constructing a drawbridge. This drawbridge is going to act as sort of a high-density floodgate, which is going to act as the one stopping mechanism so that the ocean doesn't drain infinitely, but instead only drains exactly when we want it to. I then construct a lever for both the bridge down below, as well as a secondary lever in the hallway to drop the support structure, because that's just going to be a single use. Once the drawbridge is connected to the lever, I then seal off the door at the bottom of the little stairwell and build walls blocking the whole thing in. And now up here we have our final structure. Once again, this is a support that is stuck to the ceiling above it and connected to a lever. Now I'm going to tell the dwarves to pull the go button, and we get to witness the fireworks. Now, before you look at me and say that was kind of anticlimactic, I would like to point out that I already had the drawbridge down below closed. So now there's one final thing that we need to do now that this entire stairwell is full of water, and that's open the drawbridge. A few clicks later, and I have the ability to drain the ocean on command. The fortress is no longer at threat of spontaneous flooding. And you want to see some bad frame rates? Well, I can make them bad by simply pulling a lever. Let's speed things up so that they are a little bit more manageable. And of course, give the caverns a real quick peek. See how they're handling the tidal wave. Oddly enough, after this progresses for a few seconds, the frame rate does actually improve. It goes from about a frame per 2 seconds to about 20 to 30 frames a second, once it's done the initial tidal wave at the very least. And then the ocean gradually drains out and becomes traversable. So using this nice structure I've already constructed here, we're going to build a stairwell down to the ocean floor and begin fixing my mistakes from the past, including putting a plug in that hole that I dug, very misguidedly, and removing the final few bodies from the screw pump back here. Turns out there was a lot of bodies exposed when I did that, and the dwarves have quite the work ahead of them. And inside the fortress, renovations are still underway. This is gonna take a while. And this cleanup literally took 2 seasons. Tomb after tomb after tomb after tomb. But all things considered, the dwarves' spirits were still very high, and the population had climbed up ever so slightly. And there was only a few steps left to finish with the last of the flooding. I had to remove these walls here so that we had access to the pump once again. But digging out around this pump was actually a mistake, as I would later find out, because that would open up a pathway for dwarves to walk into that trench of water, which was currently considered accessible, and there was a body in it, which oddly enough led to a Congo line of drowning. I just don't want to talk about it, to be honest. I tried to save them as best I could, but, well, the number of dead climbed. So much for gaining population. After the unexpected drownings, I figured I needed to take some vengeance on a helpless victim, so I took some goblins and chained them to the ocean floor. They were criminals, after all. They'd tried to kidnap my children. Once the 2 of them were tightly secured, I tried to do my best Godfather impression, and, well, apparently water breaks chains, and they managed to both successfully run away from the ocean. Well, tell the tales of my great powers and defenses, I guess. Well, that's awkward. At the very least, we get to witness the ocean refilling, because that never gets old. The dwarves still had quite a bit of work to do to get the last of the flooding dealt with, so I dug this little chamber just to the left of the drainage trenches underneath my entry platform, and then smoothed both sides and then fortified both sides, letting the water run through and off the side of the map. At this point, I was splitting my time between working on my new defensive structure and fixing the remainder of the flooding alongside of renovating the pre-existing fortress. I couldn't stand to have all that mud everywhere forever. Of course, I would leave some for some visual accents, but that ocean was still just hanging out, and as cool as it was to spontaneously drain it so that I could work on the new defenses, it did hurt the frame rate enough that it was a little bit tedious. However, once it was drained, it gave me a lot more flexibility, which allowed me to begin construction on what would power the filling mechanism for this new reservoir I have just south of here. The way this will work, I've got this little pump stack, which is going to vertically pump water up several levels, from where it enters the fortress to where I need the water to be. The lowest most layer of this pump stack is completely isolated from the rest of the fortress, so even if it does flood, it's not going to get into the living room unless somebody breaks the pump stack, so nobody tantrum near the pumps, got it? But anyways, the way this works is water will flow in from the outside ocean, but I'm going to do it at a diagonal so that there's no pressure and it doesn't overflow in this room. It'll then flow past these pumps to the left off the map and power water wheels. These water wheels will power the pump stack. Each water wheel produces 100 power, which will be plenty once it's flowing. This is my favorite method of generating power and usually the one that I use. The entry tunnel for the water itself was dug while the ocean was drained, making the whole thing quite convenient to set up. Now, the last thing I gotta do is pull the lever and, oh no, there's goblins in my fortress. And they just killed Sergeant Oinkers. Well, that simply won't do. We're gonna have to deal with this properly. So I'll send the squads into the drainage tunnels to deal with these goblins. Thankfully, they've had some time to train, and the goblins appear to just be scattering in fear, those cowards. Fortunately, they weren't able to do too much damage, except for this one, who managed to get into some of my crafting rooms and turn one of my dwarves into a literal pincushion. Bloody shame. Thankfully, the axe dwarf Wolf managed to get in and get in between the problem and the dwarf they were shooting at. And with that minor green setback, we can now get back to work. And so now we can begin the water flow by digging a diagonal entry point for the ocean. Remember, if things go horribly wrong, I can simply pull a lever now and drain the ocean. And everything about this spot right here is currently isolated from the fortress using this door and this drawbridge. And the final step before I dig into the ocean is fortifying the drainage tunnel connected to the water wheels. After one quick once-over of all of the components, I pull the lever and let the water flow in. And I unlock the door and allow Scariest here to mine through the rock, letting the salt water flow into the new power trench. And it seems to be working flawlessly. And the water flows all the way to the left and off the map. Excellent work, dwarves. Now the final piece of the great puzzle is I need to open this drawbridge, which will supply the pumps with water. Once again, everything's completely isolated. And just like that, almost as fast as my fortress filled with water, the pumps fill my reservoir. Now, whenever enemies arrive, all I need to do is pull this lever, and what happened to my fortress will happen to whatever is attacking me. We did do an early test run, and it performed flawlessly. Now, before you go, what am I looking at? Just remember, Dwarf Fortress prioritizes bridge sprites over water. There is water on top of these bridges, I swear. You'll just have to imagine it. It's easily proven by the process of draining the water. Look at it go. The one thing left to do is to poke the goblins and make sure that they're aware that our welcoming party is ready for their future arrival and funeral. And of course, we gotta get rid of the rest of their messengers. We'll make those goblins regret not taking their swimming lessons as a child. The fortress was beginning to look like its former glory, and even the squads were getting some training in. We'd built them full sets of steel at this point, and things were starting to get back in order. Finally.
Woohoo!
And just like I'd ordered it, the goblins arrived, but at a very poor time, because my third squad had just been returning from a siege. And it didn't matter how quickly I locked all the doors and tried to seal those invading goblins in, my squad collided with them on the surface. And while this could have been just fine, the issue is the dwarves were a little bit too good at their job and routed the siege. But the unfortunate reality was only 2 dwarves were caught out by the goblin assault, and it took a while for the rest of the dwarves to rush to their aid. Many dwarves were lost in this impromptu attack. A damn shame if you ask me. And just as the dwarves were beginning to collect their losses, another goblin siege arrived. This one was a proper siege, ready to fully assault the fortress. They were even requesting a parley, one of the very few alerts in Dwarf Fortress that you can't turn off. So I did what any good fortress owner would do. I grabbed the bodies and the few injured dwarves who remained, and wound up for the next attack. And I denied their pathetic parley. As the goblins entered the fortress, the dwarves sat waiting patiently. A few of them found my weapon traps in the entry hall and probably lost some toes. A very enthusiastic cat tried to scare the forces away, but I think just simply incentivized them. They require pets, and those goblins were willing to oblige. They wandered down into the muddy hollows, following the cat. The dwarves were ready to see these goblins fall, before realizing they'd made a great mistake. Once again, the overcompensation of the No Alerts challenge led to myself, making a very rookie mistake. Not only did I forget to lock this door, but I also forgot to build something in front of it. So the goblins had direct access to my fortress, and there was nothing I could do. In a panic, I told my squads to station in the entry hallway, but the goblins had already made their way up into the water wheel room, next to an unprotected trench filled with exposed water. My enthusiastic soldiers charged upstairs, hacking through the goblins as they climbed, but many of them hadn't been around to survive the original floods and had no experience swimming. And as they dodged north to avoid the spear blows from the goblins, they quickly fell into the water, and many soldiers were lost that day. Some of them were, of course, able to climb out, but unfortunately, more dwarves would fall victim to the surprise town. Thankfully, their numbers would eventually prevail, which blocked the flow of water, and the goblin siege was broken. The bodies were easy to recover, since I was smart enough to put a drawbridge in, so I did just that. I blocked the drawbridge and set up more coffins, and we waited patiently for the next goblin siege. Fortunately, we didn't need to wait too long. Within half of a season, another army arrived, just as big, if not bigger than the last. It appears the goblins had got the message. As if it was an invitation, the dwarves denied the parley and opened the door and waited for the goblins to enter the fortress. Of course, this time they made extra sure that the side door was sealed. The goblins entered the hallway, and just like their friends before them, moved down the spiral halls towards the fortress. They could hear the thumping of the dwarven feet scampering about beneath them as the goblins entered the long, murky corridor. The dwarves were sure that they'd made no mistakes, and that whatever happened next, no more dwarves would fall in Surprise Town. The dwarves opened the floodgates after sealing the goblins within. And because, in some ways, ASCII makes events like this clearer, the dwarves drowned all of the goblins. And for those of you who can't read the mythical symbols of ASCII, here's the unit list with all the blue names of the goblins drowning, and of course the dwarven reenactment of the Bay of Fundy. Welcome to Surprise Town, goblins. And for once, it's you that are getting the surprise. The dwarves of this fortress are very unfortunate. Some are expert swimmers, but most of them are just missing their deceased loved ones. The challenge itself wasn't that big of a deal. The most surprising thing for me that happened was my own mistakes. Of course, the sieges still had the big notification in the top left, which was kind of hard to miss. And so only Mega Beasts and Forgotten Beasts were an actual threat. I think I maybe overcompensated for them a little bit too much. If I attempt this challenge again in the future, I'll have to construct the fortress in a more fast and loose fashion, allowing more things to actually surprise me. Because at this point, what could possibly go wrong? It's not like something's just going to walk into my fortress and kill one of my dwarves, right? And besides, if something like that were to happen, fun comes for us all eventually. Raise a glass, friends, and lay your eyes upon the great waterworks of Surprise Town. Some of the music in this video was provided by a small Croatian folk band called Flotnar. I'm probably mispronouncing that. They were very generous and let me use their music free of charge. Their Spotify and YouTube channel are pinned in the comments section. Links to the specific songs used are also available in the description of the video. Everything else came from the Dwarf Fortress soundtracks. Thank you very much for watching this video. I needed something short as a stopgap between the last big video and the next big video. I've got another project that I'm actively in the process of finishing up, and I've actually taken a week off of streaming to finish it. But I kind of wanted to get something else out in the meantime because that one's going to take another week to polish. And this lets me get something out sooner than later. So definitely keep an eye out for some blood-sucking vampires. But in the meantime, if you'd like to see more of this fortress, I'll link the entire VOD playlist in the description of this video. I think it really says something about the scale of these videos when I say that this video was only taken from about 35 hours of footage. If anything, this was a quick one. But regardless, did you enjoy it? If you did, make sure to slap a like on the video, and if you haven't, maybe subscribe. I make these from time to time. If you want to watch some streams, you can find me at twitch.tv/BLINDIRL, and of course you can find other things that I post on blindIRL.com. Lastly, because these dwarves got a hefty dose of hydration, don't forget to hydrate in the comments. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I will see you again very soon.
Bum bum. Bum bum.